Well, thank you, and thank you, Sabina and Claudia and Felix for organizing everything. I really appreciate this invitation and being invited here. It's great to be having this kind of prolonged conversation about both criticality and what it means to kind of rethink data and data visualization. So today my talk is going to be sort of derived actually from my book, but it's called Beautiful Data, and I'm going to be talking about kind of the histories of perception, cognition, and reason that for me underpin the kind of broader epistemological backgrounds that sort of underpin our contemporary interests in big data, analytics, and clouds and crowds. I should probably apologize too. Although as an American we don't do it quite as often. My German is very bad, and so therefore I'm not even going to try, and I apologize. I do think from reading the transcripts, though, that this talk has a lot to do with the previous talks, and also with both our Kina and Ellie's provocation to also be thinking more critically about what data visualization is and what kind of imaginaries we have around data visualization. So I'm just going to dig in. So anyway, today we seem to be in a world that's full of smart cities, smartphones. This is Songdo in South Korea, where I've been working for a while now. It's a supposedly smart city being rolled out by Cisco and other large conglomerates. And there's things are popping up all over the world. And these things are smart because they're full of sensors. This is just a New York City example. And behind these smart sensory cities are, of course, vast archives of data centers. And what really interests me about this whole architecture between the data center and the smart city is, of course, that this is also full of screens. And what's really interesting here is, so these are also architectures of sensation and perception. And what's really interesting, this is a standard IBM operations center being test run here in Songdo in South Korea a year and a half ago. But these things exist in cities everywhere from Rio to Songdo. But what's really great about this whole architecture is that this serves no anthropocentric or even anthropomorphic purpose, because basically all this data is being analyzed by IBM algorithms. There's simply too much for the actual operators to see it. So this is a purely performative architecture, which makes us wonder, okay, so what is all this data visualization doing anyway? In that it's hardly about representing some external reality to its operators. And along with this visualization comes this sort of idea of a kind of eternally elastic or plastic capacity to deal with ever more data. This is actually my latest fixation. This is a drone operator in the latest DARPA projects around kind of attempting to cognitively enhance the speed by which analysts can analyze the images and identify. And basically they're doing it by zapping the brain with electrical charges and attempting to then get feedback from the brain. Apparently the brain, the operator elicits a message that they identified an important target a few milliseconds before they actually can hit the button. So you can actually enhance performance and speed, supposedly by just going straight into the neurons or into the kind of perceptual sensory network. So this idea of an ever-enhancing cognitive sensory environment, right, these hypersensory spaces and this enhanced cognitive performance demands some accounting, some kind of like, how did we get there? And how do we think about this relationship between smartness, and all the other forms of life that are kind of currently entering our world? So I'm really interested in trying to think about this. In order to think about the relationship between how our neurons are getting increasingly networked directly into our media systems, I want to start with 4 images. So I'm going to back up now and tell kind of prehistory of what I think is this condition, and ask some questions about both the terrible and violent elements of this history, as well as what possibilities can we recover in a kind of Benjaminian way from a kind of genealogy of our contemporary situation. So I want to open with 4 images: cybernetic black boxes, the nervous system of a frog's eye as it speaks to the brain in the language of cybernetics, the magical number 7, a famous study inaugurating the cognitive sciences, and a new form of multimedia political spectacle based on multiple screens and information inundation. In the course of this talk, I will traverse these 4 fields, so think of them together, put them in your head. It will be my mission to consider how circuits and networks travel between neural nervous nets to overstimulated spectators to political spectacles, and how this has transformed ideas of both reason and perception to create both new forms of affect, governmentality, and territory. And of course, I'm going to go really quickly because information inundation was a virtue in 1959, and it's a big data world, so find the pattern. So if you don't catch everything I say, I've said this before, don't worry about it. It will be repeated. You'll find the pattern. So anyway, see it as an enactment of our contemporary age. So I'm just going to open a little bit with cybernetics, which are the sciences of control and communication in the animal and machine. I feel like almost everyone knows what this is, so I'm not going to belabor it, but a few points to just kind of cover. As is now, this is the cover of the Human Use of Human Beings from the late 50s, a kind of book popularizing this term to the American public. And of course, as you can see, the main focus here is these kind of communicative arrows in this closed world with these little boxes talking to each other. As everyone knows, mathematicians, physiologists, and engineers at MIT working on anti-aircraft defense quickly came to realize that human beings tend to act repetitively under stress, and therefore began to think that you could isolate patterns of behavior, and you could begin to think about machine behavior and human behavior in the same kind of logical steps, and that you could isolate these processes, thus heralding sort of an equivalence between, if we will, thinking humans and machines both in the terms of computation. There's a couple important features to cybernetics, which I'm just going to go over, which is it's behavioral, it's black boxed or non-ontological, which is to say we don't really care if it's a machine or a person in those little boxes, which you can see. All we care about is what it does. It's probabilistic and anticipatory, so there's always a preemptive or future tense. You need to know where the plane's going to be to shoot it down, obviously. And it is fed on this idea of a data-rich world, which is to say that you have to call patterns, again, these kind of errors, out of a large number of inputs. So there's this kind of idea that this world is very noisy, and your job is to find the pattern for prediction. But to begin with our question of visualization and vision, it is perhaps of little surprise, considering that identifying enemies and preys was quite a concern, that perception, particularly vision, should be a major center of computational and cognitive science concern. In 1959, the landmark psychology study, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, and the fact that the frog's eye is speaking to the brain should already tell you something, was published. The paper was written at MIT by cyberneticians Warren McCullough and neuroscientist Jerome Letvin, who actually goes on to then be the president of the Aspen Design Conference, the pivotal design conference in the United States, until about the 80s, biologist Humberto Maturana and logician Walter Pitts. The authors never claimed it was about human vision, but this stopped no one from picking it up. Rather, it was vision sui generis that interested the authors. McCullough liked to say that he produced experimental epistemologies, that's his language, not veritable truths. So here we have this kind of transformation in the type of truth claim the sciences are making, a change in objectivity, if you will, which is to say McCullough liked to build machines that revise scientific ideas of knowledge, machines for making thought. This study went on to become one of the most fundamental, and even to this day, it's one of the critical studies for developing vision in computers. Apparently, some of these machines even got built. The authors started with a simple premise. Assuming a world of informatic overload where our senses are always bombarded by inputs, how can we assume that all processing occurs in the brain? In short, considering all the data, how do we ever get a signal? Obviously not because we cognate in the head. Clearly, it can't all be happening here. The scientists discovered, and this is nothing short of remarkable, the historian of science, that frogs' eyes separated from the brain may yet still respond to transformations in the visual field. The authors worked on moving edge receptors in the frog's eye and discovered a fiber observed that, and I quote, responds best when a dark object, smaller than the receptive field, enters the field, stops, and moves about intermittently thereafter, end quote. They concluded, and this is amazing, and I quote, the eye speaks to the brain in a language already highly organized and interpreted instead of transmitting some more or less accurate copy of the distribution of light on the receptors, end quote. Their fellow colleague Arbib summarized that this proves the frog's eye, and it's literally an isolated optic nerve. They kind of cut it off from the brain. Could deal with universals like prey and enemy. In short, it is a Turing machine. Perception, therefore, becomes the same as cognition. So sensing becomes the same as smartness, if you will. And not incidentally, McCullough and Pitts also wrote the article on neural nets. That's another history you can ask me about. But anyway, so now we have sensing equals smartness. This equation has emerged. And of course, this opens the possibility that perception has itself become modelable. Their initial logic is critical. They argue that the optic nerve does not transmit every piece of data or light it picks up. Instead, they created an experiment where an optic nerve is exposed to variations in light stimuli. We're studying variations and pattern recognition here. It is the relationship between dark to light, movement and stillness, not a specific stimulus that is studied. Neuroscience does not understand the image as a representation being transmitted and then translated upon arrival in the brain, but rather understands vision as encompassing the entire relationship, structuring the act of observation. Information entering the eye is every moment both an index and command for future action. It is the structure of the interaction of the net that matters. What we're trying to extract is the pattern that reveals preys or enemies, not the ontology of enemies, not what is the stimulus, but what is the process that creates certain outcomes and effects. Vision becomes a channel, a communication structure, just like in the mathematical theory of communication, where we're interested basically in what you could, as Weaver and Shannon put it, information is not a measure of what you say, but what you could say, what the structure, what kind of interactions the channel facilitates. And while such subjective perception had been found in 19th century physiology and psychology, it is no longer a problem for scientific objectivity and knowledge. So there's no problem about getting past the body or the fact that processing is occurring out in the world, but is now positively embraced for its technological potential in neural nets. The very nerves extracted from any particular body are capable of processing and analyzing data. The act of processing information and the act of analyzing it become the same. The possibility is open that this decontextualized seeing process can be therefore rebuilt in other locations. And this is clearly not insignificant for machine vision. This is not insignificant either within the histories of visuality. This model desires a purely technical and autonomous eye. If one wishes to see an insect, one builds a frog's eye. If you want to see a missile silo, maybe it's different. Human vision, who knows? Worst case, maybe we can just rewire it just like DARPA wants to do, and it can be more frog-like and work better with those servo-mechanical machines. Vision circulates. There's no norm for vision. The ideal of a singular objective form of vision is replaced by a fantasy of effectiveness or affect serving particular functions. This is an eye extended out of the body and into the body and out into the world, a vision that can materialize and act on its own, flies eaten and airplanes blown up, for example, a network cognition beyond the brain, and a new way to understand the differences between things. We're not talking about stable enemies or preys again. This is, not, if we will, non or anontological. We're discussing the algorithm that decides those relationships, the pattern, just like the cybernetic feedback loops of relations that create certain outcomes. This is based, however, in a lack of regard or perhaps an automation of recording and the assumption of this informatically dense world. So there's really quickly a transformation in how we're thinking about perception after the war to being a kind of assumption of a kind of over-recorded informatically rich world from which perception is derived. So we end up with this wonderful equation. Cyberneticians thus exist in an environment of infinite potentiality out of which process, order, and meaning was carved out of this informational excess. But structuring the frog's eye was a broader claim that perception could be modeled as a communication channel. How can we make this eye I better, capable of analyzing more data, making more decisions. Perception became equivalent to cognition, as I've shown. So that brings us to the question, what is cybernetic cognition look like? If eyes could think and speak a sophisticated language, no less, then minds and brains are also part of the communication structure. Nowhere is this more visible than in cognitive psychology, a field central to organizational management and transforming both artificial intelligence and psychology. A few years earlier, in 1956, the purported founder of cognitive science, George Miller, wrote a paper that continues to be the single most cited piece in contemporary psychology, The Magical Number 7 plus or minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information, end quote. Miller was explicit throughout his writing in the 50s that his prime concern was to use cybernetics and information theory to challenge behavioralist psychology and psychoanalysis simultaneously. So he's taken on the whole field. The magical number 7 opens with a political reference that serves as a segue to rethinking the political, the perceptual, and the aesthetic. And I'll quote it here. My problem, says Miller, is that I have been persecuted by an integer. For 7 years, this number has followed me around, has intruded in my most private data. The persistence with which this number plagues me is more than a random accident. There is, to quote a famous senator, a design behind it, some pattern governing its appearances. Either there really is something unusual about the number, or else I am suffering from delusions of persecution. That senator was, of course, McCarthy, and the delusional form of persecution that Miller describes was none other than a faith that 7 defines a natural and normative limit, structurally and mechanically ingrained in our minds, a pattern produced by nature or a higher power, a pattern not amenable to change. So basically he says, like, believing in this kind of truth of the number 7 is basically paranoid. Just, however, as organizations like governments could take paranoid formations, so can scientists be deceived by their own minds. A pathway is thus opened by which the single psyche and the networked organization can collapse and be similarly treated by science through the notion of information. The article then proceeded to survey an entire history of research on judgment and memory recall. First covering articles on the inability of individuals to distinguish pitch, 7, then visual data points, 7, then decisions between different senses, 7. The article treated any form of stimulus the same, but repeatedly, Miller argued, there reappeared a cognitive limit. Test subjects in psychological studies given certain amounts of data can only seem to remember or differentiate between 7 data points or 7 bits of information, plus or minus 2. There's a big error margin in this study, but we're not going to talk about the quality of the science. We're just going to talk. By the way, the number 7 is why you have in the United States, at least, we have 7 numbers in our telephone. 7. This had a remarkable impact actually on what people thought people could remember. Before, however, being deluded into believing that there was only one normal standard for human memory and information processing, from which individuals may be either normal, subpar, or geniuses, Miller argued that thinking psychology in terms of information might transform a set and stable limit to a permeable threshold. So what does Miller mean by information? Here he calls on the mathematical theory of communication and the communication sciences, very creatively, might I add, to revise our ideas of psychology. Miller equated information with the amount of variance in a study. And to quote him, the equations are different, but hold that aside. But if we could hold tight to the idea that anything that increases the variance also increases the amount of information, we cannot go far astray. No. Another way to understand this equivalence is to think that if a study demonstrates a very wide number of different cognitive responses, so like people respond really differently to the stimulus, then finding the single unitary pattern is more difficult or wields more information about psychology than a study in which all test subjects perform the same. So the more variance you have, the more information you can get, but the harder it is, of course. One study, the more variant, reveals there are many more options or possibilities for action than another. This increase in possible outcomes is equivalent to the probabilistic nature for him of cybernetics and communication information sciences. The advantage of this new way of talking about variance are, he continued, simple enough. So this is all very simple. This is super simple. Variance has always stated in terms of a unit of measurement. So before, we used to measure things by like varies in so many decibels or wavelengths or whatnot. By rethinking variance as equal to information and the amount of transmitted information as equivalent to covariance or correlation, Miller opens the possibility of a stable scalar curve, so we can move from like 7 of whatever input to this rather malleable and relational term, the bit. So basically, we can begin to think in these mobile and relational terms instead of set units. And then we can begin to think, in his words, in terms of channel capacities. So instead of assessing the intensity or character of the stimulus in a particular measure, you move to how many decisions need to be made, thus making decisions between sounds, or he also applied this to organizational management or decisions by management of organizations. They both can be treated by the same method. So it's totally scalable. By removing any set or stable scale or unit of measurement, it becomes immediately evident that cognition can now be thought at different scales, organizational to individual, and extracted as a material process to be modeled and enhanced. Having established both the apparent repetitive nature of the magical number 7 and the equivalences between psychological responses and communication theory, Miller then proceeds to explain the implications of this finding. He argues that if we consider an observer in terms of channel capacities and information, we can also begin to think about the limitations to recall and judgment in terms of compression and recoding, computational terms. Miller says absolute judgment is limited by the amount of information, how many decisions you need to make. So immediate memory is limited by the number of items, how much data you can store. So in his analysis, he splits psychic processes into space and time for computational purposes. This separation between the location of immediate decision-making and the transfer of past data into the present mirrored, of course, the structure of computers at the time, but also allows Miller to separately consider how to store data from how to operate on it. And that kind of split is kind of critical. So, for example, in terms of memory, Miller notes that we can remember and differentiate many faces, more than 7, if we have histories and contacts with people, but problems doing so if it's a random event or a crime. The test subjects have easier times remembering sentences or full grammars than discrete letters. So obviously I have an easier time with I love this talk than the grid above. Changes in color when given a... Come on, guys. Changes in color when given a comparison color field, right? You can tell that these are 2 different colors of red, are better than when you're shown one color block at a time, right? So per input or bit. So basically, Miller argued, therefore, that the way to increase the amount of information an observer can listen to is by changing either the number of items per input or the bits of information, the number of decisions or relations. So if you can recode the information, you can re-chunk it, you can put more in people's brains. These are all examples of information compression in Miller's language recoding. And here's an example. This is from this famous study. Clearly, we can't just remember all those binary digits, but if we regroup them, right, you might be able to remember more. And he says about this, it's a little dramatic to watch a person get 40 binary digits in a row and then repeat them back without error. However, if you think of this as merely a mnemonic trick for extending the memory span, you will miss the more important point that is implicit in nearly all such mnemonic devices. The point is that recoding is an extremely powerful weapon, and so we've now weaponized our minds, for increasing the amount of information that we can deal with. So in one form or another, we use recoding constantly in our daily behavior. So now we're up to 40. So if you recode the data, you can enhance, right, the cognitive capacity to retain data and process it. Awesome. So anyway, now we've got this new perception cognition 7 channel. But what matters is it doesn't matter if we're talking about colors or letters or sounds. They can all be treated with the same method. The article thus paralleled the relationship developed by McCullough and his colleagues on the eyes. It should be of no accident, of course, that the papers written in the same laboratory as McCullough, Letvin, and Miller are all members of the Research Lab on Electronics at MIT, or that there's a close correspondence between all these researchers in rethinking perception and cognition through cybernetics. Psychologies and machines became epistemologically equivalent, and the intent was to figure out how to model the perception-cognition process itself and increase its ability to operate in informationally dense environments. So our main point, got to get everybody up, right? You have no thresholds. We can keep increasing the amount of data you can take in. I'm testing that now. What makes these studies remarkable, outside of the fact that no research was done by Miller himself. So by the way, this is all a big data project. This whole study just surveyed other people's work in a new recombinant epistemology that has worlds to say to our contemporary obsession with big data and analytics. But even more importantly, perhaps, is that Miller, at the final moment, makes a stunning statement. He asked at the end of the survey whether 7 was arbitrary or necessary, a reality or a construction. He answered that even posing such a question, like, is this natural, will induce, in his words, psychosis. Perhaps, if instead of obsessing about the number 7, we notice a pattern and stop looking for a causal reason, we could avoid sinking into any of these delusional or paranoid states at all. Miller implied that a brain reconfigured through communication theory would be less susceptible to paranoia and delusions, or perhaps in keeping with the extended networked intelligence of the frog's eye, a psychotic structure would be the normal model for cognition, since we're now permeable to the environment, accepting our less than authoritative perspective. So this is subjectivity as science, and definitely non-objective minds might be healthy. Asking whether 7 is really a natural, immutable, and eternal truth, or whether it's a construction, it's just not going to get you anywhere scientifically. What is real or constructed? Who cares? The question implies is, what work does 7 do? What can it teach you about how to recode information? Miller never assumed the genetic stability architecting the mind's cognitive processes at the time. In a moment before either minds or machines were well known, this new mind machine was produced that was both biological and emerging, computational but not mechanistically reductive. This ontologically unstable mind machine emerged logically from the psychologist's embrace of communication, since this is where the threshold between the exterior and interior and the stability of reference or scale were both abandoned. Communication theories and cybernetics allowed Miller to dispense with liberal prehensions or normative concepts of mind and move to circulating information. The observer, now reconfigured as a communication channel, stood prepared to serve as a conduit for ever more data, infinitely enhanceable vision and cognition reconfigured through a discourse of information inundation into material processes that could be modeled, circulated, and forever enhanced. But why stop there? With the emergence of computing, weaponry, let's keep going. Neuroscience, scale it up, baby. Networks like to proliferate, and this new informational cognition perception channel is scalable. So, moving on to these influencing machines now. 1959, the same year the study on the frog's eye is released, in the midst of the Cold War, a new architecture of perception emerges, a vast cavern filled with 7 screens, that's not arbitrary, built by the famous architect, cybernetician, and futurist Buckminster Fuller, and designed by Charles and Ray Eames, designers who worked with Wiener, Claude Shannon, Letvin in the course of their careers, and they also engaged with Jerome Bruner from the same lab as Miller, so they're really familiar with the science. And the piece was edited by John Whitney Sr., a pioneer in computer animation and a major proponent of cybernetic ideas in cinema. The installation was constructed in Sokolinsky Park in Moscow as part of the first cultural exchange, a training program, if we will, between the USA and the USSR. Here at this site, many new forms of presentation are paraded. As audiences are shown multi-screens, Khrushchev and Nixon debate the variable merits of American and Soviet kitchen design and technology in front of the new television cameras, the scene revealing both new forms of spectacle and politics, or politics as spectacle. And I quote, totally new type of presentation in the words of Charles and Ray, is envisioned as a love letter between two nations in a world where writing would no longer suffice. A glimpse of the USA, a day in this foreign country's life that by the end would cease to be foreign. In the face of this imagined textual and lingual collapse, the designers believe visual images might serve a new mode of human interaction. The Eames believed in spectatorship as choice, so under the influence of communication science and these new cognitive sciences, they actually ran these classes where they're known to ask, and I quote, how much information could be given to a spectator, a student? Just like I'm doing now. The idea of spectatorship invoked in their work was to force users to interactively pick a pattern through a vast data field. The Eames took the idea of recoding very, very seriously. 2,200 images were shown on 7 screens for 13 minutes. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people saw it. Everyone, according to Fuller, had, and I quote, tears in their eyes when they came out, end quote, of the opening show. Rumor was it, especially Khrushchev, Ray Eames called it an affective experience. The movie opens with a view from above, the aerial flight. In the night sky, the voiceover intones, Soviet and American cities look the same. The scene from the plane ominous in the midst of debates over thermonuclear war. But this view from above rapidly condenses into the network. If we can even remember the history of planes over cities, it's only as an aesthetic device to enter the circuit. Central are images of highways, modularity, flow and speed, conspicuous consumption, 7 screens of Marilyn Monroe winking from Some Like It Hot. The Russians clapped every time. Images of the perfectly racially integrated society, of course. And then a black screen, the culminating moment. All the screens are turned off, and one final signal emerges. A single purple flower illuminated that final screen, the final signal. It is a forget-me-not flower in English, chosen for its symbolic connotations of love, friendship, and remembrance. In Russian, the name of the flower, and love, you can correct me, my Russian is terrible, nezabudki, translates literally as forget-me-not. The installation overcoming any question of translation in the sheer cadencing and patterning of visual imagery. This perfect translatability, it should be noted perhaps most critically, includes images of this perfectly racially integrated society. The irony that is the very infrastructure for an emerging American spatial apartheid, highways and modular tract housing, that is the substrate for collective vision of a single humanity, should not be lost. But the movie's major statement is that flow and communication will overcome difference between nations, between people. As an aside, which is hardly an aside, it's a really important part of this talk, the show is being accompanied with a Family of Man show by Steichen. So on the outside, as you walked into this pavilion, you would see the Family of Man. You can see sort of this, right here, you can see sort of this final kind of photograph. So you have 2 forms of visuality operating here. One, a kind of documentary, realist, kind of public works project from the 30s, sort of device where text and image are still working, and the above is this sort of like huge streaming channels of data. And of course, and this is just an image from the catalog of Steichen. I couldn't actually get the actual image from MoMA, but you can see text and image would have bet. These were hung in different spaces, and there was text sort of explaining the image. And Steichen's show was, the Family of Man show by Steichen, of course, was an ode to biological diversity and humanity, framed under this structural patina of standard heteronormative life cycle and about kind of the biological unity of all humanity. If Steichen has a single idea for how human beings share a world and a definitive history and life cycle or biological time that unites us, the aims have a different idea, one of choice, patterning, reverberations, and redundancies. And this is the editing flowchart that shows kind of the intensity and speed of images with the sound. And it was based for them on ideas of computer flowcharts, actually, that they got from IBM. So each viewer was to select this pattern through 2,200 images. This installation, unlike Steichen's, operates not through identification with others, but through assimilation and substitution. Glimpses was an installation that cannibalized an older organization of sentiment and affect affiliated with idealized images of race and sex, like you see above here. As an architecture, these ideal moments, though, are paraded too quickly and in feedback loops without linear narrative or causal relations to actually organize the visual plane coherently enough to permit you to identify identification of difference or similarity to occur. So there's no kind of mise en scène or sort of identificatory gaze operating here. Instead, what we notice is the ability to substitute images and patterns for one another to induce a different sensation. The purpose appeared to be enhance or increase the capacity of vision itself to travel, analyze, and assimilate data. Whether pattern recognition and identification and subjectivization are equivalent is unclear. So it's not really clear whether the subjectivity of the observer is quite the same as the one is entailed by the Steichen show. The relationship, however, between the 2 displays, both as 2 epistemic forms of visuality and 2 temporal experiences at juxtaposition in collaboration and competition, is worth noting. This emergent perceptual territory relies on maintaining an ongoing tension between multiple, so there's multiple times operating here, forms of spectatorship and perception from which senses vacillate and reorganize themselves between these modes of interaction, shuttling viewers between identification and the logistics of assimilation and substitution. The affective field is kind of, you can feel it wavering. To assert their separation from older forms of spectatorship and to distance themselves almost from the Steichen show, the Eames view this installation as a carefully constructed case study in communication theory. That's how they talk about it. A critical experiment in information management, as if to demarcate their absolute lack of concern for recording, indexicality, documentation, or older forms of media. Whitney and the Eames were conscious, deliberate, perhaps overly insistent on separating this multimedia architecture from cinema. Most times, Charles argued, people confuse multimedia with multi-images. In that case, this logic implied any film is multimedia. But Eames continued, this work was different, and I quote, it had not only multiple images, including the relationship between still and motion pictures, but also sensory things. We used a lot of sound, sometimes carrying them at high volume so you could feel the vibrations. We did it because we wanted to heighten awareness, end quote. The language alerts us to a new site of technical articulation. Awareness itself takes on a materiality to be modeled and coded as a form of media. The installation itself is imagined here as an eye, maybe even a cognating one, and this is the chart for the eye. And you might want to compare this, the kind of architectural renderings of the show to like a Bayer show where you still have kind of a body with this eye. They never actually represent the spectators in any of the renderings of this show. So they argued that changing one image at a time was useless. Only changing images in groups of 3 or 4 so that I can find a pattern is useful. They call this a new form of editing that only considers the relations between images. They emphasize that it's not montage, and we can discuss whether or not that claim is true. They wrote of the installation, you saw that it, and I quote, models thought. It also models vision. For Eames and Whitney, the editor, these installations that could attenuate the nervous system made the observer choose patterns and consume more information in a manner that saw cognition and perception, simulation and analysis compressed and transformed into a single channel. The 7-channel presentation was indeed carefully cognitively thought out, timed to the moment, based on a theory of iterative feedback between spectator and scene. And like I said, the notes to this show have a great deal of cybernetic work and work by cognitive scientists in them, including Jerome Bruner, and discussions with Shannon and Weaver. So the flowcharts, as I said, mime those in computer science, which patterned the presentation. And the film editor of the 7-channel presentation was the avant-garde filmmaker John Whitney Sr. In discussing one of his early films, soon after 1959 event, he wrote of producing, and I quote, a liquid architecture that would create a structured motion that begets emotion. Whitney sought a machine cinema no longer in the realm of image and index to produce a new world of entropic potentials that would directly tap into the nervous system and produce a mobile space. And I quote, as early as 1957, I had begun to construct mechanical drawing machines. I was not motivated to create representational images with these machines, but instead wanted to create abstract patterns in motion, to evoke the most explicit emotions directly by its simple pattern configurations of tones and time, end quote. To accomplish this ambition of surpassing the image to directly induce emotion, Whitney used the leftover remains of anti-aircraft servo mechanisms from the Navy to construct machines that could produce graphics on film without filming any original drawing or live action. And there you can see him with one of his servo mechanisms that he produced to directly inscribe. And the credits, this is an example of what these machines could produce. This is a movie made shortly thereafter, Catalog from 1961. Again, one of the first examples, I guess, of machine-made cinema, fully automated. So Whitney sought an algorithmic vision that made machines authors in the production of human experience, a form of machine vision whose work did not operate at the level of the visible image, but through the attenuation, according to him, of the nervous system itself by way of this computational logic. And Saul Bass's Vertigo was also made with these things, the introduction, if you've seen it. If the organizers of the United States Information Agency pavilions still thought in terms of images and architectures of geographical space, Whitney discussed his work in terms of harmonies, fluids, sine waves, raw patterns, and material abstractions, implying the production of a visual, acoustic, sensory environment that would transform cinema and affect territory. Vision took a materiality for Whitney as a process to be designed, replicated, and computationally programmed. In design, as in the anatomies of neuroscience, visuality gained a new logic to be encoded in the architecture of Cold War propaganda. And here we must speak of capacities and channels. If Steichen argued for the oneness of man, the Eames argued that images such as highway interchanges could be universally familiar, which is questionable. This assumption of universality appeared to imply that the installation provided a format of kind of species unification, perhaps an alternative definition to population from that of like the nation state from Steichen, one grounded not at the level of the organism, but at a nervous level, based on sharing neural patterns and forms of perception rather than identifying or empathizing with similar subjects. This global nervous network was propagated through a concept of vision as a channel or threshold. The Eames spoke of the choice of 7 screens in terms of producing credibility, which he defined as offering people a sense they had seen something they were familiar with and was real in a documentary sense without necessarily allowing them to focus or fulfill identification with any one image. And he says something critical here, and I quote, "We wanted," said Eames in a later interview, "to have a credible number of images, but not so many that they, the spectators, couldn't be scanned in the time allotted. At the same time, the number of images had to be large enough so that people wouldn't be exactly sure how many they had seen." So you can actually count. It's more like an experience. We arrived at the number 7, and that was not arbitrary. This perceptual architecture insists on eye capable of finding patterns in vast flows. This eye, however, can never be sure, never stable, always available, as in the new epistemology of cognitive science and cybernetics, to assimilate more data. So all these 3 examples, look, the observer here is not a normative or static body, but one always capable of being enhanced. And vision here is linked to cognition as a channel that can be materialized, built, replicated, and circulated. Theirs was a world emerging from careful timing of data delivery. We have always been committed to information. Charles recalled the Eames motto, information, not representation. For the Eames, it was only communication, all the senses recombinable, language itself reconstituted or transformed in this multimedia system. But what form of architecture then, and they went on to say, we consider this all as architecture. But what form of architecture was this? Eames then turned to say that architecture is, and I quote, complex problem solving. Architecture here becomes non-spatial, part of a new cognitive territory that is about data processing and infrastructures for integrating information rather than static structures to organize stable subjects in space. This installation, made for the United States Information Agency and also sponsored by IBM, a corporation whose motto is think, was supposed to parallel thought with a machine by forcing spectators to choose patterns through data, just like we choose a logic to break down processes and program them into a computer. And here they repeat this exercise in 1964 in an actual film called Think, in an installation for the World Fair in New York in 1963-64. So this is also, however, a temporal question, one of the archive. Absolute storage, the ability to save everything, is the unconscious desire of structuring this form of visuality. Interestingly enough, however, the nature and organization of the storage system and even the identities it creates, those questions that defined the 19th century archival impulse, are repressed here in the interest of producing these relational forms of seeing. There's no ontology or concern for recording here. Perhaps this inflects itself in the cannibalization of racial and other forms into the architecture, smooth space for global integration where the autonomy of vision, the interactivity of attention, and the absolute recordability of the worlds are given. So for the last 3 minutes, I'm just going to conclude. So we've come far. We've traveled from the interior of our nervous systems to the structures of government, and I'm left to ask what the implications of this situation are for older political orders. When the Soviet newspapers commented on this installation, the journalists asked, where are the examples of American might and scientific technology? End quote. In other words, they were saying, where's the violence? Where's the military capacity? One might extrapolate, therefore, that the journalist was wondering what state shows up to prove its power by showing winking girls, playing children, organized through circulative networks. Charles Eames also had a problem, though. The designer of this multimedia world appeared to struggle with what their own creations had caused. Our own work, Charles Eames recalled 20 years later, and I quote, has come back to haunt us. And at this point, they're trying to distance themselves from the happenings and the counterculture. He went on to say that, and I quote, franticness of cutting tends to degenerate the information quality. We've always been committed to information. It's not a psychedelic scene in any way, end quote. We are not, he implied, inducing non-rational mental states, although what rationality might denote in a world of cogniting smart eyes is anyone's guess. On the other hand, the USIA officials labeled it the most successful piece of psychological warfare ever staged. So we have many, many responses to this thing. How then do we think these polls, the comments on the seeming erasure of violence made by the Soviet press, and the Eames concern about the potential for psychedelic, if not psychotic, outbreaks? In this attentive environment that integrated our neural nets and our governments, where difference, racial, national, biological, was deferred as a question, and I didn't say it was removed, it's just kind of consumed into this hyper-visualizing machine, and rendered politically impotent through consumption into this interactive architecture, what still haunted in the world what still haunted, in Eames's words, this machine. So we're posed to the question, basically, of what remains of politics under these aesthetic and technical conditions. It's possible, of course, to read this assumption of racial iconography into substitutability and relationality in these architectures of 1959 as servicing contemporary race and terror warfare, and there are many ways we could do that. In the communicative reconception of perception, cognition, globally embedded within the editing tactics and surround image sound environments of these science experiments and spectacles, color and form become pure gesture and movement in the service of this roving and nomadic mode of perception that terminally threatens civic life, not to mention the very civil rights movement that's happening at the time, whose very iconography is actually consumed into itself. So this is actually about the problem of hypervisibility to the point of, I guess, a certain form of incapacity to encounter difference. So here I want to explore for a moment some other possible, so this is like the bright side of the talk, okay, so it's been pretty depressing. In my opinion, there are many ways affect could have been organized in the pavilions and laboratories of the late 1950s. It's important to remember that 1959 had little clarity as a historical moment. The Cold War was simultaneously heating up and reaching détente. This was a kind of lull between Hungary and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Race relations were changing in the United States, to mention a few of the proximate events to this cultural exchange. It was not at all clear what visions of the future of politics or humanity would emerge from these new aesthetic and technological practices in politics, social and communication sciences, design, and art. And the affective field is literally wavering at this moment. You can really feel it, like moving between these different modes of identification, empathy, and experience, and how. So we have the circulative and documentary and relationship to each other, both producing potentially new ways to network between populations, the emergence of computer animation. Here, the very movements of the machines, right, are starting to fold on themselves to produce almost difference through the repetition of the same pattern, which is basically what he would have these machines do, is feedback their own information until they began to spiral out. And the production of new forms of mind that are both new forms of vision and, of course, mind that are both plastic and multiplus. So these nervous nets and capacious memories being studied were imagined differently. Was the mind plastic or static, constantly rewired, or absolutely pre-programmed? At the time these discourses were all stable and unclear, neuroscience had not yet recuperated the absolute authority of genetic or biological determinism so endemic to our present. So these collaborations and multiplications, if we will, are the so to speak, a weak messianic possibility that I'm excavating at this moment about how we're going to recombine. In cybernetics, the tension between storage and circulation continued to animate the production of endless interfaces. So this kind of multiplicity also increases the penetration of media into life. But even as vision and cognition were redefined as circuits, older problems of subjectivity, identity and knowledge, authority and signification haunted the apparatus, creating differentials from within. This is indeed a question of temporal organization. Nezabutki, forget-me-not, the flower that is not only about friendship, but about mourning, associated with romance and tragedy, but also promise. Lovers in their death threw these flowers so they may live forever in the hearts of their forlorn, thus, however, forever forestalling the ability of their partner to move on. I might also ask whether or not this is the structure of melancholy and reactionary politics. Do we return to long-standing ideas of territory or of militarism as the function of the state, or do we open ourselves, as feminists and other critical race theorists have long argued, to the possibility of the cyborg, to the new relations between bodies, subjects, spaces, and mediums that such spectacles and sciences afford? This is the nature of politics now. Negotiate the level of attention and nervous networks structured into our architectures of perception and affect. Forget me not, both a promise to rethink Cartesianism, difference in our relations to each other, and a threat that we will fail to do so, multiple temporalities, and endless feedback, providing both the opening to chance and the danger of repetition without difference. Thanks.